The first thing Paul Coffey noticed was the quiet. For 32 years, the steel mill had been his alarm clock. Every morning at 5:30, the shift whistle from Bethlehem Steel had pierced the dawn, vibrating through the thin walls of his modest home in South Buffalo. But today, March 18, 1982, the silence felt like a physical presence, heavy and unfamiliar. Paul rolled onto his side, squinting at the bedside clock, 7:42 a.m. He'd overslept, but it didn't matter anymore. 3 months since Bethlehem Steel had temporarily laid off 8,000 workers, himself included. 3 months of waking up to silence. "You coming down for breakfast?" Loretta's voice called from downstairs. His wife of 27 years, still keeping the routine. "Be right there," he called back, voice thick with sleep. The bedroom window framed a gray March sky, the kind that hung over Buffalo 5 months of the year. From this second-floor window, on clear days, he used to see the smoke from the stacks, great billowing clouds that meant prosperity, that meant America was building something. Today, the skyline looked naked. In the bathroom, Paul splashed cold water on his face, the pipes groaning with age. The man in the mirror was 53 but looked older, lines etched deep around his eyes, salt and pepper hair thinning at the crown. His father had worked the grain mills until the day he died. Paul had followed him into industrial Buffalo, but chosen steel instead. "Steel's the future," his father had said, not unkindly. "Those grain elevators are yesterday's news." By the time Paul started at Bethlehem in 1950, the massive concrete grain elevators along the Buffalo River were already declining, victims of the St. Lawrence Seaway that diverted shipping routes away from Buffalo. But steel had seemed eternal. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of coffee and toast. Loretta stood at the counter, knife poised over a stick of butter. Her blonde hair was now mostly gray, pulled back in a practical ponytail. She'd been a beauty when they'd met at a church dance in '54, and to Paul, she still was. "The Buffalo News is on the table," she said without turning. "More bad news about Republic Steel." Paul grunted, pulling out a chair. "What now?" "They're saying permanent closure by end of summer. Another 3,000 jobs." His stomach knotted as he scanned the headline. Republic Steel had always been Bethlehem's main competitor in Buffalo. If they were closing for good, they said temporary for us, too, he muttered, reaching for the coffee pot. Loretta sat across from him, her blue eyes steady. "Maybe it's time to think about something else, Paul." "Like what?" "I'm a steel worker. Been one since I was 21. "You're many things," she said quietly. "Father. Grandfather. You're good with your hands. You could what?" "Stock shelves at Tops Markets for minimum wage. Pump gas." He hadn't meant to snap, but the words came out sharp as steel splinters. Loretta's face didn't change, but he saw the slight stiffening of her shoulders. 32 years at the mill had made Paul a man of routines and certainties. The world made sense when you clocked in, did honest work with your hands, clocked out. A man provided. That's what men did. "Pete called," she said, changing the subject. "Lisa's having the baby shower next Sunday. They'd love if we could come early, help set up." Their son Peter lived in Rochester now, one of the first to leave when things started changing. Smart kid. Got a degree in business from the University at Buffalo, married a nice girl, and moved away from the rust and the uncertainty. Their daughter Mary had gone even further, all the way to Atlanta. "I'll check the calendar," Paul said, a weak joke that made neither of them smile. His days stretched empty before him, marked only by the unemployment office visits and the dwindling number in their savings account. The telephone rang, startling them both. "I'll get it," Loretta said, rising. Paul stared at his hands spread on the kitchen table. Good hands. Strong hands. Calloused in places where gloves couldn't fully protect from the heat and metal. What good were they now? "It's for you," Loretta said, holding out the receiver. "It's Eddie from the union." Paul took the phone. "Eddie? What's up?" Eddie Kowalski had been union rep for 20 years, a fighter, a believer. His voice now sounded tired. "Meeting at the hall at noon. Company's making an announcement. Word is, it's not good." Paul's chest tightened. "What kind of not good?" "The permanent kind. Just be there." The line went dead. Paul hung up slowly, aware of Loretta watching him. "They're saying it's permanent," he said. The words felt unreal. "Meeting at noon." Loretta nodded, but said nothing. What was there to say? They'd been living on borrowed hope for months. The union hall was packed by 11:30, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Men Paul had worked alongside for decades clustered in groups, voices low, faces grim. Some still wore their work jackets with the Bethlehem logo, as if clinging to an identity about to be stripped away. Paul found Eddie near the front, talking with other union officials. Eddie's face was drawn, older than his 55 years. "How bad?" Paul asked without preamble. Eddie shook his head. "Total shutdown. The whole plant. Officially announced this morning. They're blaming foreign steel, high labor costs, the recession. Same story as Republic, Anaconda, all of them." Paul felt something collapse inside him. They're keeping a skeleton crew through June to wind things down. Everyone else, effective immediately. 8,000 jobs. Gone. Just like that. Paul had known, of course. They'd all known in their gut, even as they cashed unemployment checks and told themselves it was temporary. Buffalo's steel industry had been in decline since the mid-70s. Foreign competition, outdated facilities. But knowing didn't ease the blow. The plant manager arrived with a team of executives in overcoats. They looked uncomfortable, out of place. The room fell silent as Eddie introduced them, his voice flat. The manager spoke of regrettable market conditions, insurmountable challenges, a changing global landscape. Paul barely heard the words. He was thinking of his first day at the plant in 1950, how his father had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're set for life, son." Afterward, men lingered in the parking lot, stunned, angry, lost. Some talked of relocating to mills in Pennsylvania or Ohio, chasing the dwindling steel jobs like nomads. Others spoke of retraining programs, though no one seemed to know what they'd retrain for. A few of the younger men mentioned the GM powertrain plant that was still operating in Tonawanda. "You coming to O'Neill's?" someone asked Paul. The bar across from the plant had been their Friday tradition for decades. "Not today," Paul said. "Got to tell Loretta." He drove home slowly, past the massive complex of Bethlehem Steel. The furnaces were cold now, smokestacks empty against the sky. Past that, the hulking concrete grain elevators stood like ancient monuments along the Buffalo River, most abandoned since the 60s, when the St. Lawrence Seaway had diverted grain traffic. The twin pillars of Buffalo's industrial might, both fallen. When his father had arrived from Ireland in 1920, Buffalo had been America's 8th largest city, a manufacturing powerhouse where a man with strong hands could build a life. The grain elevators along the river had processed more grain than any port in the world. The steel mills had forged the skeleton of a growing nation. Now what? Loretta was in the living room when he arrived home, folding laundry with mechanical precision. One look at his face told her everything. "It's official," he said, sinking into his armchair. "The whole plant. Permanent." She nodded, hands continuing their work. "I'm sorry, Paul." 32 years, he said, the numbers suddenly overwhelming. "What am I supposed to do now?" "We'll figure it out," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. That night, Paul couldn't sleep. He slipped out of bed at 2 a.m. and went downstairs, walking through the darkened house like a ghost. In the kitchen drawer, he found a half-empty pack of cigarettes he'd quit 3 years ago on the doctor's orders. He took them to the back porch and lit one with shaking hands. The night was cold, stars sharp above the silhouettes of houses. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistled, one of the few sounds that still marked Buffalo's industrial pulse. He thought about his father, who'd survived the Great Depression by unloading grain ships at the elevators, coming home with bleeding hands but enough money for bread. Who'd taught Paul that a man's worth was in his work, in what he built, in how he provided. What would his father say now? The cigarette burned down to his fingers, and Paul startled, dropping it to the concrete step. He ground it out with his slipper, suddenly aware of the cold seeping through his robe. The next morning, Paul drove to the plant. He wasn't sure why. There was nothing for him there now. But some magnetic force pulled him toward the place that had defined his adult life. The security guard recognized him, gave a solemn nod as he drove through the gate. "Just don't stay too long, Mr. Coffey. They're already starting to shut things down." Paul parked in his usual spot, one of only a dozen cars in a lot built for thousands. The plant looked different already, or maybe it was him that had changed. He walked toward the main production floor, his feet following a path worn by decades of routine. Inside, the vast space echoed with absence. A few maintenance workers moved among the machinery, their voices unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. The great furnaces that had once glowed orange with molten steel stood dark and cold. Paul, that you? He turned to see Larry Bennett, a foreman who'd started the same year as Paul. Just came to see it, Paul said, gesturing vaguely. Larry nodded, understanding. Hard to believe, isn't it? My old man worked Lackawanna Steel before Bethlehem bought it. Brought me here when I was 10, told me this was what built America. He gave a bitter laugh. What happens to America now, huh? Paul had no answer. They stood in silence, two men adrift in a cathedral of industry that no longer needed their devotion. What are you going to do? Paul finally asked. Larry shrugged. My brother-in-law's in Florida. Says there's construction work there. Thinking about it. You don't know yet. Well, don't wait too long, Larry said, clapping him on the shoulder. This city's bleeding out fast. Paul walked the production floor one last time, touching machines he'd operated for decades, saying goodbye to a life. By the time he left, his eyes burned and his throat felt tight. Driving home, he took a detour along the Buffalo River, where the massive grain elevators stood in abandoned grandeur. His father had worked in those concrete giants, unloading ships from the Great Lakes before the St. Lawrence Seaway had redirected that traffic. When the grain business declined, his father had urged him towards steel. Adapt, he'd said. The smart ones adapt. But adapt to what? What was Buffalo without steel and grain? The summer of 1982 unfolded in a haze of disbelief. Each morning, Paul woke to the unnatural silence, the absence of the shift whistle that had ordered his days for decades. He went through the motions, filed for extended unemployment, attended job fairs where men twice as young as him stood in line for half as many positions. He watched Buffalo hemorrhage population as families packed up and left for places with names like Houston, Tampa, Phoenix. Mike Dolan's moving to Texas, he told Loretta one evening in July. Says there's work in the oil fields. Loretta was at the kitchen table, calculator and bills spread before her. And nothing. Just saying. She looked up, eyes tired but determined. Would you want to move? Start over somewhere else? Paul didn't know. The thought of leaving Buffalo, the only home he'd ever known, felt like another kind of death. But staying was its own kind of surrender. We could move closer to Peter, she suggested. Rochester's economy is different. Kodak, Xerox. Or Mary's been asking us to consider Atlanta. I'm not living off my children, Paul said firmly. That's not what I'm suggesting. Loretta's voice sharpened. I'm talking about being near family while we figure out what's next. We're not dead, Paul. But part of him felt dead, or at least lost. Who was Paul Coffey without the mill? Without the routine, the purpose, the identity he'd carried for 3 decades? In August, Paul found himself drawn repeatedly to the abandoned grain elevators along the Buffalo River. Massive concrete structures, once the largest grain transfer point in the world, now standing empty like ancient ruins. He parked his car and walked along the river, looking up at these monuments to a vanished era. On his 3rd visit, he noticed a young man with a camera photographing the elevators. Private property, Paul called out, though he had no authority to enforce anything. The young man turned, unalarmed. I know. I'm documenting them before they tear them down. Tear them down. Something in Paul's chest tightened. They can't tear these down. The photographer, perhaps in his 20s with wire-rimmed glasses, approached. The city's been talking about it for years. Some of them, anyway. Too expensive to maintain, too dangerous to leave standing empty. These elevators built this city, Paul said, hearing the defensiveness in his voice. My father worked here when Buffalo was the grain capital of America. I know, the young man said, surprising him. That's why I'm photographing them. They're incredible structures, historical landmarks. Some people are trying to save them, actually. Who? Preservationists. Architects. People who see value in them beyond their original purpose. Paul studied the young man, trying to understand. What good are they if they're not storing grain? The photographer smiled. That's the question, isn't it? What's the purpose of anything once its original function is gone? He extended a hand. I'm David, by the way. I'm working on a book about Buffalo's industrial architecture. Paul shook his hand. Paul Coffey. I worked at Bethlehem. 32 years. David nodded, recognition in his eyes. The steel plant. That's another loss for the city. You sound like you're not from here. Originally, yes. Left for college, came back last year. David gestured toward the elevators. Everyone told me I was crazy. Buffalo's dying, they said. Maybe it is. But I think it's just changing. Changing into what? David shrugged. That's what we have to figure out, right? What happens to a place, to people, when what defined them disappears? The question followed Paul home, echoed in his mind as he tried to sleep that night. What happens to a man when what defined him disappears? The following week, Paul found a flyer in his mailbox about a community meeting to discuss the future of the riverfront and the grain elevators. He almost threw it away, but something made him tuck it into his pocket instead. The meeting was held at a community center in the old First Ward, the Irish neighborhood where generations of grain scoopers had lived. Paul felt out of place among the mix of gray-haired old-timers and young people with earnest expressions. He recognized David, the photographer, who waved him over. "Didn't expect to see you here," David said. "Just curious," Paul replied, taking a seat. The meeting was led by a woman named Linda Bauman, who introduced herself as an urban planner. She spoke passionately about the grain elevators not as relics of a dead industry, but as opportunities. Cities across the world are repurposing industrial spaces, she explained, showing slides of warehouses turned into lofts, factories transformed into museums. These concrete cathedrals are unique to Buffalo. They're part of our heritage, our identity. Paul listened skeptically at first, then with growing interest as others spoke. An architect, a historian, a young entrepreneur talking about how other Rust Belt cities were reinventing themselves. "This isn't about erasing our industrial past," Linda said. "It's about honoring it while creating something new." After the meeting, Paul lingered, studying the displays of proposed riverfront developments. David approached with Linda. "Linda, this is Paul Coffey. He worked at Bethlehem Steel for over 30 years. His father was a grain scooper." Linda's face brightened. "Mr. Coffey, we need people like you involved in these conversations. Your perspective, your memories, they're invaluable." Paul shrugged uncomfortably. "Not sure what good memories do when people need jobs." "That's exactly the point," Linda insisted. "We're trying to create new opportunities while preserving what makes Buffalo unique. The next generation needs to understand what built this city to help rebuild it." "Rebuild it into what?" Paul asked. "That's what we're figuring out," she said, echoing what David had told him days earlier. "But we know it needs to include the people who've been here all along. Would you consider joining our community advisory board? We meet monthly." Paul hesitated. "I don't know anything about urban planning." "But you know Buffalo," Linda said simply. "You know what these places meant, what they still mean." That night, Paul told Loretta about the meeting. "You should do it," she said immediately. "You've been wandering around for months like a ghost. It's just meetings. Talk. It doesn't put food on the table. Neither does staring at the wall," she countered. "And I'm tired of you acting like we're going to starve. We have savings. I can get more hours at the hospital if needed. We'll manage." Paul looked at his wife, really looked at her for the first time in months. She'd been working part-time as a receptionist at Mercy Hospital for years, something he'd always viewed as her little job, not their livelihood. The realization shamed him. "When did you become so strong?" he asked softly. Loretta's expression softened. "I've always been strong, Paul. You just didn't need to notice before." 2 days later, Paul called Linda and agreed to join the advisory board. The autumn of 1982 brought more plant closures across Buffalo. Republic Steel shut down permanently in October, followed by announcements from smaller manufacturers. The recession deepened. Buffalo's population continued to decline as families sought work elsewhere. But for the first time since the layoff, Paul had somewhere to be, something to contribute. The advisory board met in a former warehouse near the river that had been converted into offices. Around the table sat an unlikely mix: former industrial workers like Paul, young professionals, community organizers, a city councilman, even an artist who wanted to project light shows onto the grain elevators. "These young people are dreamers," Paul told Loretta after the third meeting. "They talk about art spaces and kayak launches when people need jobs." "And," Loretta prompted, "and, I don't know, maybe dreaming is what Buffalo needs right now." He paused. "They want me to record my memories of the steel plant. For an oral history project." "That's wonderful, Paul. What's the point of talking about the past?" Loretta put down her knitting and looked at him directly. "Because the past matters. Your work mattered. It built things that still stand. And maybe your stories will help people understand what was lost and what can be found again. The first interview was awkward. Paul sat stiffly in front of David's camera, answering questions about his first day at Bethlehem Steel, the smell of the coke ovens, the sound of the furnaces. But as he spoke, something unlocked. He found himself describing not just the technical aspects of steelmaking, but the people, the camaraderie, the pride, the sense of purpose. He talked about watching the steel they made go into skyscrapers in New York, bridges in California, automobiles across America. We built things that last, he said. That was the point. We weren't just collecting a paycheck. We were making America. When the interview ended, David thanked him warmly. That was incredible, Paul. Would you be willing to do more? Maybe even give a tour of the plant site, explain how things worked? Paul found himself agreeing. Over the following weeks, he returned to Bethlehem Steel with David and a small team, walking them through the now silent plant, explaining each area, each process. With each telling, the grief loosened its grip slightly, replaced by something else, a sense that even as the steel industry died, what it had meant could be preserved. In November, Linda invited Paul to speak at a community forum about the future of Buffalo's waterfront. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces young and old, Paul felt a strange calm. I worked at Bethlehem Steel for 32 years, he began. My father unloaded grain boats for 40. Between us, we gave the city over 70 years of labor. We built things, real things you could touch, that had purpose. He paused, gathering thoughts that had been forming over months. When the plant closed, I thought that was the end. Not just of my job, but of everything that mattered. What's Buffalo without steel and grain? What was I without my work? The room was silent, attentive. But I've been thinking, it wasn't really about the steel itself. It was about building something that lasts. Contributing. Being part of something bigger than yourself. He gestured toward the window, where the grain elevators were visible in the distance. Those elevators haven't held grain in decades. But they're still standing. Still matter. Maybe in a different way now. After the forum, several people approached to thank him. One was a woman about his age who introduced herself as a former secretary at Republic Steel. My husband worked there for 25 years, she said. He died last year, still angry about the closure. I wish he could have heard you tonight. It might have helped him make peace with it. That night, Paul couldn't sleep. He went downstairs and found Loretta, also awake, a cup of tea steaming before her at the kitchen table. Did I wake you? He asked. She shook her head. Thinking. Paul sat across from her. About moving. His stomach tightened. You want to leave Buffalo? No, Loretta said, surprising him. I was thinking about Peter asking us to move to Rochester. And I realized, I don't want to leave. Not now. Even with everything closing? The city dying. Loretta's eyes met his. Is it dying? Or just changing? All these young people moving into those old warehouses downtown, fixing up houses in the First Ward. The meetings you're going to. It feels like something's starting, not just ending. Paul considered this. He thought of David, of Linda, of the others he'd met, people who saw possibilities in the ruins of industrial Buffalo. I don't know what's going to happen, he admitted. But for the first time since the layoff, I'm curious to find out. Spring came late to Buffalo in 1983, as it always did. But when it arrived, Paul noticed changes along the riverfront. A developer had converted one of the old warehouses into apartments. A small brewery had opened in the shadow of a grain elevator. Signs announced a summer concert series on the waterfront. Small changes. Tentative. But changes nonetheless. On a bright May morning, Paul received a call from Linda Baumann. We've secured funding, she announced without preamble, for the first phase of the grain elevator light project, and for the industrial history center we've been discussing. That's great, Paul said, genuinely pleased. The History Center had been a frequent topic at their meetings, a place to preserve the stories, artifacts, and significance of Buffalo's industrial era. There's more, Linda continued. We want to offer you a position, part-time to start, as a historical consultant and tour guide. Paul was silent, processing. You know these industries better than any of our academics, Linda explained. Visitors want authenticity. They want to hear from someone who lived it. I'm not a tour guide, Paul said slowly. I'm a steelworker. You're both, Linda countered. You're a steelworker with stories that matter, that help people understand what Buffalo was and what it can be. After hanging up, Paul walked out to the backyard where Loretta was planting her vegetable garden, her hands deep in the soil. The same hands that had packed his lunch for 32 years, that had held him when he came home defeated after the plant closure. "They offered me a job," he said, "at that history center they're planning, giving tours, telling stories about the steel plant, the grain elevators." Loretta sat back on her heels, squinting up at him in the sunshine. "And I told them I'd think about it. It's not real work, not really. Isn't it? Seems to me preserving history, teaching people, that builds something too. Something that lasts." Paul looked out over the yard, toward the direction of the lake and river, where the skyline of Buffalo stood against the blue spring sky. The smokestacks were cold now, the grain elevators empty. But they still stood, monuments to what had been, and maybe signposts to what might come. "I spent my life building things you could touch," he said softly. "Steel. Now they want me to build something you can't hold in your hands. Memory. Understanding. Sounds important to me," Loretta said, turning back to her planting. "Different, but important." Paul thought about his father, about the lessons he'd taught about work and worth and adaptation. About Buffalo, the city that had been shaped by grain and steel and was now trying to reshape itself without them. "Maybe," he said finally. "Maybe it is." In June 1983, Paul led his first official tour through the partially renovated grain elevator that would become the Buffalo Industrial History Center. A group of 20 people followed him, some former industrial workers like himself, others too young to remember when Buffalo's waterfront had been a place of production rather than consumption. "This city was built on grain and steel," he told them, his voice echoing in the concrete chamber. "That era is over now. But what we learned, what we built, what we valued, that doesn't have to disappear. That can be the foundation for whatever Buffalo becomes next." As he spoke, sunlight streamed through the high windows of the grain elevator, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like memories made visible. Paul Coffey, steelworker for 32 years, now steward of a different kind of building, not of steel or grain, but of understanding, of continuity between what had been and what might yet be. Outside, the Buffalo River flowed past as it had for centuries, indifferent to the rise and fall of industries along its banks. The city was changing, adapting, reinventing itself, just as Paul was learning to do, not erasing the past, but building upon it, finding new purpose in the foundations of the old. It wasn't the future he'd imagined, but standing there, watching the light play through the concrete cathedral of Buffalo's industrial past, Paul felt something he hadn't experienced since before the plant closed: possibility.